Hi there, I'm AK. I make glitchy bass music and play many different instruments. For the past few years, I've been studying all different sorts of music production techniques, and I'd like to share what I've learned with all of you. To that end, today I'm going to take you through 10 of the most important concepts in music production that I've learned through countless hours of trial and error. I'll be using Ableton Live to demonstrate most of the concepts today, but I'm hoping I've structured the video in a way that's platform agnostic. Pretty much every DAW out there should have the basic tools you need to follow along. There's a table of contents in the video description if you want to hop around, but of course, I hope that you'll watch the whole thing. I can only continue to do this stuff with your continued support. If you are so moved, please like, comment, and subscribe. Alright, cool. Let's get to the good stuff. Tip 1. Volume automation. There are many different tools that are used to control volume. Compressors, EQs, dynamic tools, transient shapers, and many more. And for every tool, like a compressor, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different flavors and types. While these tools all have their specific uses, understand that tools like compressors were developed for engineers to control the dynamic range, which is a fancy word for relative volume, of different tracks without automation. Compression was classically used to even out unintended shifts in volume from a drummer or guitar player's performance, without having to ride the volume level on the mixer the whole time. Most DAWs have a general purpose gain staging device. In Ableton, it's called Utility, and it's also, believe it or not, my favorite device. With Utility, the gain knob can easily be adjusted to raise or lower the gain of the track, which affects its overall volume. Of course, it can also be automated, which I know might be obvious, but this allows you to do a lot more than you might think. Want really tight sidechain compression on your bass? Instead of setting up some complex routing and dialing in some settings, just do it with Utility. It sounds awesome, and it's way faster. Want to dial this in a bit more? You can individually dial in each curve to have it react appropriately for each hit of the drum. This would be really challenging to do with a normal compressor. Maybe you want to have something just fade out. With Utility, you can dip the volume automation down and have it easily come back. Maybe you want to build excitement. Bump up the part of the phrase that you want to emphasize. When using volume automation in this way, make sure to do it with a gain staging device, rather than using the track volume. This way, if you want to adjust the mix for the entire track, you still have your track volume, which is independently calculated from the small dynamic changes you've penciled in with Utility. To be clear, my general point here is not that you should never use compressors. The point is that when addressing problems in your mix or trying to build dynamics, sometimes the simplest tool is actually the best one for the job. Tip number 2, using reverb. Reverbs are designed to simulate space, to make it sound like the instruments you're using are being played in the same room. That said, there's a ton more that you can do with reverbs, like using reverse reverbs to make creepy, sweeping transitions, or adding alien-like dimensions to simple sounds. In fact, the entire genre of big room dance music uses reverb as a core part of its sound design. One bad music production habit is to fill the empty space, to have some instrument, lick, or phrase firing all the time. This makes music that is difficult on your listener, and it doesn't let your music breathe. The human ear can only comprehend so many things at once, and it's very hard to develop a groove with so many things happening, all at the same time. So, the next time you find yourself working with something like this, which sounds good, but a little bare, instead of filling the mix with more instruments, reach for a reverb, which I'll implement here as a send effect, and send your tracks to that reverb at different levels to add different dimensions of space. Another thing I like to do is add effects after the reverb to beef it up and make it a little bit more unique. Tip number 3, the double saturator. Vespers, the founder of Warp Academy and producer extraordinaire, turned me on to this next tip. There are very few insert effects units that you can actually get more mileage out of by doubling them. In our case, the saturator is one of those units. The short story is that you can greatly increase the detail and harmonics of a sound by saturating it, and then saturating it again. And I'll use this on all sorts of stuff. Snare hits, synth leads, dirty basses, pads, even kick drums. I guess the simplest tip here is that next time you go for a saturator, try it twice. Tip number 4, LFOs. I'm almost embarrassed to admit that it took me a really long time to understand what LFOs are. Sure, we might know that it stands for low frequency oscillator, but it doesn't make noise. So what does it do? Rather than thinking of an LFO as an oscillator, which makes noise, think of it as an explanation of movement over time. Think of it like a wave. In this way, LFOs are used to make automation easier. They let the computer figure out how a knob should be wiggled over time rather than forcing you to pencil in the knob you want to automate. LFOs were originally built into hardware synths, so we could make complex sounds with movement without needing to train an octopus. It just so happens the shapes and patterns available to us on most LFOs are familiar oscillator shapes: sine, saw, square, etc. The rate is the speed of the wiggle, and the phase is where the wiggle starts and where it ends, relative to one period, that is, peak to peak. The depth describes the total amount of movement that you'll allow, which you can think of just as minimum and maximum values. Some fancy LFOs may have more parameters, but those are the basics. I use LFOs all the time. They help me discover cool and interesting automations that I never would have penciled in. For a quick demonstration of this, bust out your favorite dubstep bass preset, Sine of Massive, and assign 2 different LFOs with different speeds to the filter cutoff. And then play a note and listen back to the movement that this creates. It would be a beast to pencil this type of automation in. My advice is to use LFOs when you know you want movement in a sound, but you're not exactly sure how much or what shape of movement you want. It's a lot quicker to try a bunch of different things with an LFO without getting in there with the pencil tool. For the Ableton Live users out there, I'm using Max for Live here, which is an implementation of the Max MSP framework inside of Ableton Live that allows you to build devices like LFOs, which control other parameters. Tip number 5, limiting. Limiters are commonly used by mastering engineers to bring mixed tracks up to commercial volume. They essentially create a volume ceiling in decibels, which forces the level of the incoming track under that ceiling. There's also usually a gain knob for boosting the level of everything else, essentially attempting to make everything as loud as possible while still leaving in some dynamic range. Of course, just because limiters are used in the mastering process doesn't mean we can't exploit them for our own ends while we're doing sound design. I've created some really cool sounds, effects, bleeps, boops, squeaks, and squawks by using a limiter as an effect. So make a sound, or take a sample, with a really nice long decay. Then slap on your limiter and just abuse the hell out of it. Lower the ceiling and crank up the gain. It's like you're forcing everything to be as loud as possible while clipping it at the same time. With some sounds, particularly those with a long decay, this can bring interesting nuances into the main focus. When I'm over-limiting in this way, I almost always render the audio because this technique seldom produces audio that is usable as is. By chopping up the audio block and using fades, over-limiting is a nice way of extracting interesting artifacts for sound design out of a synth or sample in a way that almost bears no resemblance to the original sample. This also might be interesting to do on an a cappella track to isolate the singers and breaths. In fact, I did a track on my first album called Breath, which uses this technique all over the place. You could also try it on a drum loop to get some digitally clipped and harshly processed drum hits, all with one simple device. Do yourself a favor and drop a gain staging device after your limiter so you don't destroy your ears. Tip number 6, dry wet. You almost never want to turn knobs to 11. In fact, I'd argue that any plugin without a dedicated dry wet knob is suspicious, since balancing dry and wet is one of the hardest jobs for any producer. Too much wet and your beats won't hit hard. Too much dry and all your stuff will have no atmosphere and no sense of space. It's like the yin and yang of electronic music. Luckily, Ableton Live gives you the tools to create your own dynamic flow of signal routing with groups and chains. This effectively lets you create a dry-wet knob even if the plugin doesn't have one. I'll show you quickly how to do that, using an autofilter as an example. Simply group the device, then create another chain that's clean, name one chain filter and the other chain clean. So now we have two chains, a dry and wet. I'll draw fades between chains A and B in Ableton's chain selector. Now I can use movement in the chain selector to morph between the completely dry and completely wet signal. And I have one knob, which basically lets me morph between a completely dry signal and a completely wet or filtered signal. Most modern DAWs should have this capability, or a similar one. If yours doesn't, it's seriously time to reevaluate the tools you're using. Tip 7, half speed. One of the great things about recording MIDI is that you don't actually have to play it on time. If you're a beginner at piano or having trouble banging out a phrase that's in your head, one really helpful technique is to cut the tempo in half, literally divide it by 2, and then record the phrase at half speed. When you do this, make sure to use the metronome in your DAW, since the rest of your track will probably sound terrible at half speed. After playing your phrase at halftime, it's pretty easy to fix any obvious errors in MIDI with your DAW's MIDI authoring tools, and then you can double the BPM, bringing it back to its original tempo, and voila, it sounds like you've played that riff perfectly. Tip 8, triplets. Triplets are a really important aspect of electronic music that I'm into. They are the foundation of many different grooves and are often used to give your beat a different feel from the stale 4 on the floor thing. A 4/4 time signature, which is what most electronic music is written in, has 4 beats in each measure. That's why, when you adjust your grid, it's usually in multiples of 4. 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32. Because as we zoom in, we're continually dividing each beat into 4s. You can divide a beat into 3s. In fact, you can divide a beat into any number of slices, but using 3s, and hence triplets, instead of 4s, can give us some really interesting grooves. Here's a tactical example. We have a simple kick-snare combo. Nothing too fancy, sounds super boring. Listen to what happens when I turn triplets on and move my kick to a bunch of different locations. Not quite Parliament, but definitely more groovy. Now let's take the original groove and add some hats. I'm going to save myself some time and choose a phrase that already works around triplets. You can see how the hats line up not with my fours grid, but with my triplets grid. When you craft your drum elements with triplets, or accent beats outside of the normal 1, 2, 3, 4 cadence, this can create something called syncopation in your music. Syncopation, when used tastefully, can make music much more interesting, exciting, and often is the key to beats which seems to ebb and flow really nicely, but are also unique. Tip 9. Resampling the master. One of the most useful features of a DAW is its ability to internally route audio. Of course, each DAW will approach this differently, but most modern ones should make it relatively straightforward for you to record or transfer anything that's currently playing onto a new track. You may hear electronic music producers talking about resampling the master, which is just a fancy way of saying recording all the parts together in one track and then cutting it up again. This can be a great way to create a stylistic variation in your tracks and to manually pencil in cuts and stutters without the need for beat repeats and loop chopper plugins. In Ableton Live, you can choose resampling as an audio input option on any track. This means, if armed and actively recording, that this track will capture the master outgoing audio with no latency. In this example, we'll record the entire drum, bass, and synth part we've made here into a single track. Then I'll take this new track and advance it forward. Now we can use our simple audio editing and warp tools to mess with this audio file and create cool breaks and pauses from the original groove. The nice thing about doing it this way is that we have all the elements of our mix together, so a small change or doubled hit has a big impact on the trajectory of our tune. And we can use this to change the feel, build tension, or just make a nice and glitchy complementary part to our first section. The groove I'm using to illustrate this concept is hardly a finished tune, and I would actually recommend not using this technique in your tracks until you really have your mix dialed. This is mainly because we're flattening all the audio down and losing the ability to EQ the drum, bass, and synth parts separately. Tip number 10. Adding 7 dB to everything. I'm always trying to get my mixes quieter while sounding better. One thing you can use to help facilitate this is a gain staging device on your master, which boosts everything by 7 dB. I use Utility to do this, but any volume plugin will do. I know it might sound crazy and counterintuitive, but if you struggle with volume and clipping, just try this out. So we have everything coming out our master being boosted by 7 dB. As I construct my song, I'm going to make sure to avoid clipping altogether. You never want to see that meter in the red. You can push 0.00, but try to avoid clipping the master wherever possible. Then, once you're done with your sound design, arrangement, and track structure, when you're ready to sit down and mix, simply turn off or delete that gain staging device. You're not done mixing, but what you do have is your tune that you wrote with 7 dB of headroom, which is a really nice place to start. I like to aim to have my levels hit no louder than -6, so this technique gives me about 1 dB of volume to leverage in case I really want to emphasize a particular hit, where things start to get a bit hotter with compression or additive EQing. If you're notorious for making things too loud, try setting the gain staging plugin on the master to +8 or +10 dB. I suppose it's a bit of a reverse psychology trick, but I think there's a lot to gain, pun intended, by limiting the amount of headroom you have at the beginning of your session and then only opening it back up when you're ready to mix. It may seem simple, but I like having a low volume ceiling when I'm producing, so that when I'm mixing, I can actually turn up elements without necessarily having to turn everything else down. Thanks for spending time with me in this video. Support me by subscribing. If this video was useful to you, let me know and I'll make another. Now go make music, and don't forget to listen to my music too. Thanks for watching.